I'm Andrea Alessandro with CATIC, who is a proud co-sponsor of today's event, and I would like to kick off panel 2 with you. The topic of panel 2 is affordable housing, zoning, and law reform. And right now I'm going to welcome our panelists. We have Professor Kristen Haseney, who is a professor at UConn's Business School in the Finance Department's Center for Real Estate and Urban Economic Studies. We have Pete Harrison, the director of Desegregate Connecticut, and also the Connecticut State Director of the Regional Plan Association. We have attorney William Hennessey of the law firm of Carmody, Torrance, Sandak, and Hennessey. And we also have attorney Dwight Merriam with us today. So our previous panel focused on fair housing. We're going to transition now and have more of a discussion that addresses affordable housing. And so our panelists are going to, Professor Haseney is going to discuss a comparative analysis of the two. Then we'll transition with Pete addressing how tactics to overcome community opposition to affordable housing. Bill is going to share some case studies with us, and Dwight is going to round us out with bringing line of sight to NOAA and the challenge and barriers of legal enforceable covenants that are preventing the building of affordable housing. So I'm going to hand it over to Kristen.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you. Yeah, good morning. Thank you so much for coming. I really appreciate your being here. I think this is an important topic for us to address. Our last panel talked a lot about fair housing, and that's incredibly important and related to the topic that we're here for today. I'm going to try to bridge the gap between fair housing and affordable housing for you. First, I just want to say thank you to UConn Law School and Dean Jessica Rubin and Stacy Sisk for inviting me here to participate and to share what I have to share with all of you. So it used to be in the past that we thought that fair housing was not at all related to affordable housing. We thought that they were two separate bubbles. There was no overlap. Affordable housing was one thing. Fair housing was a completely different part of life and law. However, that's not really the case. There is overlap. We have fair housing laws that protect civil rights for individuals in the housing context, and that is not quite the same goal for affordable housing. It doesn't necessarily mean civil rights per se. It's more about allowing people within their means to have access to higher opportunity areas. In fair housing, we have, as our panelists before talked about, we have protected classes, which address not having a preference for or against someone based on their protected class in fair housing and in just the housing context. There are no protected classes in affordable housing, and so the question often becomes, well, then how exactly are they related? So first, it's about intent. Right? So as I mentioned, it's civil rights in the housing context for fair housing. It's housing opportunity and housing access to be able to access other opportunities for affordable housing, but they both relate to housing. I think we all know that at this point. There's also overlap when it comes to advertising and marketing. The fair housing laws prohibit discriminatory statements from being made, from being published, from being spoken. In affordable housing, there are many, many statements and many advertisements relating to the affordable housing and the affordable housing that either will be built or that has been built. What we need to keep in mind is that we can't be addressing the housing as this is right for a certain group of people or individual. Fair housing prevents anyone from from marketing the housing for a certain group. So we can't say this is good for families with children, or this is good for or not good for families with children. Same thing with affordable housing. Even though there's no specific protected classes for affordable housing, you do have to follow the fair housing laws when it comes to marketing for the housing, because it applies in the context of all housing, whether it's affordable or not. I took a quote that I really liked from the Greenwich Housing Authority, blend in with the greater community. And I think that's really appropriate for both fair housing as well as for affordable housing. What we want to do is we want people to integrate, and we want people to do it based on their own choice, right? We want to give the residents and allow the residents their right to be able to choose where it is that they're living. We want to give them multiple options. We don't want to silo people. We don't want to segregate people. That's important for both fair housing as well as for affordable housing, right? It's all about choice. Both for fair housing and affordable housing, that's something that's valued. So just a couple of examples of this overlap. So of course we have the classic Texas Department of Housing and Community Affairs versus the Inclusive Communities Project, or really it was the Inclusive Communities Project who initially filed the lawsuit. They talk about the structure of how housing vouchers were provided to residents, and it created what seemed like a neutral policy. It had the effect of discriminating because it continued to segregate people based on race. And so these segregated housing patterns continued on into the future, even though the policy seemed relatively neutral to the Texas Department of Housing. It had the effect of segregating communities and further perpetuating those separations. Another example, Center for Leadership and Justice versus HUD. Again, another situation where housing vouchers were provided, but it had the effect, the way that they were distributed and the way that they were implemented, it had the effect of segregating people by race. And this is a local example. This is here in Hartford. Oh, and I'll mention too, if anybody's interested, I did include the QR code if you want to read the complaint. So that's available. Challenges that we have. Housing clearly is getting more expensive, right? So there was a quote in a recent Wall Street Journal article that said the household income required to afford the typical home in the US was $39,000 in 2012, according to Redfin. As of November of 2024, just 12 years later, home buyers need to earn $126,764. It's over a 200% increase. That's a problem. How are we supposed to make housing more affordable if it's only becoming more expensive? A few options includes reducing the cost to build, right? We can update zoning. Zoning can include changing zoning so that we can build with greater density, maybe smaller lot sizes, perhaps multifamily or multiple units per lot. Other options such as granny pods, individual housing options on individual lots. And quite frankly, we have the opportunity to start to think outside the box and figure out what works for our communities on even an individual municipality by municipality level. It doesn't necessarily have to be the same everywhere. We need to start thinking of creative solutions to address these issues. Another possibility, looking at things like the Transfer Act, which is in the process of changing. For anybody who's not familiar with the Transfer Act here in Connecticut, those are laws to address brownfield remediation and other environmental contamination. Those kinds of costs have been extremely expensive, so a lot of developers have either stayed away from developing these properties, or when they get involved, they start and they walk away because it becomes so expensive, or perhaps they continue through and then it's so expensive that those costs are passed on to the residents. The developer's going to have to make up the cost somewhere, and unfortunately, it ends up being the residents who pay a higher price. As you see here, I included a quote from the Hartford Business Journal talking about the Transfer Act and the changes coming to it. Instead of it being more expensive up front, with costs that they're estimating about $50,000 in environmental review, they're looking at changing it to property owners will clean up releases either as they happen or as they are uncovered. So instead of having everybody pay these expenses up front to test the property, to submit all these applications and reviews, making it more on a case-by-case basis so that hopefully it will encourage development in these areas and at these properties. Increasing capital and resources. So increasing labor. There was another article from the Hartford Business Journal. As you can see, I'm pretty tied in with the media. I like to keep informed, and I do recommend it for you as well. That there's a shortage of labor in our state, and there's talk about changing the what's allowed for trade apprenticeships and encouraging more people to go into the trades. You know, we've got supply and demand here, and that includes in our labor market. And so if we have a shortage of labor, costs are going to end up going up. But if we have more people on the market, more people available, theoretically, under those supply and demand principles, the cost of labor will go down, or at least access will increase. So maybe we don't have to wait quite as long to get particular trades into the property to start to develop it. You know, maybe we need an electrician, but there's a 6-month wait because everybody's busy. Those kinds of time delays add costs as well. Materials as well, you know, there's the possibility that we could look into bulk buying through the state or other large groups. You know, perhaps developers can get together and say everybody needs however much lumber and they buy it together, as opposed to on an individual case-by-case basis. You know, when we use the power of collection, when we get together, we can achieve more at a lower cost. And even the possibility of loans and funds that are something a lot like the Connecticut Green Bank. The Connecticut Green Bank really focuses on making properties more environmentally friendly and energy efficient. Perhaps there's something that we can do to mirror that, but in an affordable housing context. Thank you. At this point, it's really just private lenders who have money for development. And that's great. I don't think that should stop at all, but perhaps we should consider having some sort of fund available for affordable housing, and I think the Green Bank gives us a good roadmap to follow. Finally, I think housing legislation needs mediators. Our politicians are great. You know, you can agree or disagree, and that's fine. But I think at this point, you know, we're having a lot of disagreements at the state capitol, and I think a trained mediator, like we do for housing court for summary process, our eviction process here in Connecticut, I think a mediator can be really helpful in facilitating discussions. I think we need to be able to find common ground more quickly and find goals that we can achieve together. And I think housing mediators for legislation can be a way to do that. And lastly, I think affordable housing also could stand for a rebrand. Affordable housing it has mixed reception in different communities. And I think a lot of the times people are using their own stereotypes to assume what affordable housing means and what the end result is going to look like. And, you know, I think if we were to start to brand it a little bit more in the direction of what it actually means and kind of dispel some of those myths that people are assuming, I think it could go a long way towards getting more community buy-in. And so that's it for me. Thank you so much for your time. I'm going to pass it along to my colleagues.
All right, thank you, Kristen, for that introduction, and nice to see everybody. Really appreciate the invitation today. My name is Pete Harrison, and I'm the Connecticut Director of the Regional Plan Association, which is a 100-year-old urban planning think tank based down in New York City, but involved in the tri-state area. Once a generation, we come out with a regional plan about transportation, housing, energy goals for the region. Our most recent one was in 2017, and I previously, before this role, was the Director of Desegregate Connecticut, which is a program of RPA. And the origin story of that, of course, Sarah Bronin, who was a UConn law professor at the time, put together a research project to map out all of the zoning jurisdictions in Connecticut's 169 cities and towns. And that was intentional to tell this story of why do we have a housing crisis in Connecticut? Why do we have such overwhelming economic and racial segregation? And certainly our lens to that question is land use policy. So what I hope to do in my kind of 15 minutes or so is bridge that gap about this conversation between fair housing and affordable housing, both capital A and lowercase a affordable housing, and the impact of land use on those decisions. So Desegregate Connecticut, we have 3 pillars of our work. It's economic prosperity, racial equity, and environmental sustainability. We believe in an all-of-the-above approach of addressing the housing shortage. That means action to all levels of government, at the local level, regional level, and state level, and probably not so much at the federal level right now. We also want to see all kinds of homes built, whether they're publicly owned, privately owned, to own, to rent, pretty much everything but large single-family homes on large lots we need in Connecticut. And then finally, it's to connect all related issues, because we know, as Kristen mentioned, these are not siloed conversations. Education policy, transportation policy, tax policy, these all impact affordable housing and access to housing. And unfortunately, so much of our political discourse are still very siloed. So Desegregate CT, we work really at an advocacy level, at the local level and at the state level. We try to get hearts and minds, because at the end of the day, this is a political battle. A legal element of it is a piece of that. But we are absolutely trying to win hearts and minds at every level of government to recognize what's at stake here. And if there is a thesis statement that we use a lot, and sometimes it's provocative or interpreted as provocative, is the housing crisis, as bad as it is, hasn't started yet. And the reason we're talking about it in those contexts is, of course, climate change. The previous panel talked already about the aging housing stock in Connecticut. We know that we have one of the oldest, I think it's the 7th oldest housing stock in Connecticut. So we already have a problem of losing naturally affordable housing and having too many residents living in deteriorating situations. We also know that climate change is already impacting our built environment. We know that in Connecticut, we do have coastal flooding, tidal flooding that will get worse. There will be parts of the shore of Connecticut that we will not be able to build on and we'll have to retreat from. But we also see this more tangibly in the precipitation increases in Connecticut. Rainstorms that were just summer storms are now flooding parts of our state that were never flooded before, are washing out roads, are washing out railways, are washing out homes. So we have an immediate crisis in Connecticut for housing, but it's going to get worse because of climate change. And the other part of that we particularly try to tell state legislators is that, of course, we already are seeing climate change impact our residents, our homes, our businesses. But 2 things are happening right now that are also going to impact Connecticut. And if we are smart about it, particularly at the land use side, it could be a good thing, or at least something that we can handle proactively. And one is that climate change, of course, is impacting other parts of the country significantly. We have floods, we have fires, we have hurricanes, and ultimately that is going to mean a significant amount of people that live in other parts, lower cost parts of our country, are not going to be living there in 10, 20, or 30 years. They're going to want to come to places like Connecticut. Connecticut has our problems, it has our climate vulnerabilities, but we are clearly generally better positioned to be resilient to climate change. We have much more infrastructure historically, a better political system to address some of these things. And that's a good thing. We think Connecticut is going to be a significantly larger population because it is going to be an attractive place for folks that can't afford to live or can't safely live in certain parts of the country. The other more immediate thing we're already starting to see is the insurance industry. And I've told legislators this a lot, some of them that are perhaps more skeptical about climate change. Doesn't matter if you believe in climate change or not, it matters if your insurance company does. And very belatedly, they are starting to. We are seeing that certainly in the fires in California and the recent hurricanes, even in Asheville, North Carolina. The insurance industry has been ignoring, some of it's from political reasons and legislative reasons, how much cost is actually coming to homeowners and therefore to insurance companies. So a lot of the escape valve in the Connecticut housing crisis for a long time was people moving, seniors downsizing and moving to low-cost Floridas, North Carolinas. So that's always been a little bit of churn in the Connecticut housing market. That's not happening now. We know partially it's preferences. Folks want to stay closer to grandkids, stay in their communities or their churches or whatever. But it's also certainly a lot of folks are realizing, you know what, I'm actually not saving money moving down to Florida, North Carolina, because I can't get home insurance on my condo that I bought on the coastline. So when I say that housing crisis hasn't even started in Connecticut, that is the bigger scope that we're talking about, the convergence of the existing shortage of homes plus climate change. The problem with all of this is the way our land use structure works in Connecticut, the political system behind it, is really adverse to acknowledging both of those crises. And even where they are acknowledging it at the state level or local level, we're not seeing the scale of action and the speed of action that we want to see. I just want to have an interactive part of this. I'm going to ask you all a quick question, and then I want you to keep your hands up if you think it's, if you agree with the question here. So my question is, what percentage of Connecticut's residential land is zoned exclusively for single-family housing? Raise your hand if you think it's over 50%. Okay, seeing a decent amount of hands here. Keep it up if you think it's 60%. Most people are up. Keep it up if you think it's over 80%. Okay, maybe some people know the answer to this. Keep your hand up if you think it's over 90%. Okay, we lost some hands there. 91% of Connecticut is zoned exclusively for single-family housing. That was the #1 story that emerged from our zoning atlas that we published initially. And that is inherently the problem that we're all facing here. We have 50-plus years of sprawl zoning, which is single-family zoning, single-use zoning, car-dependent zoning, low density. And as the first panel talked about, it's not a coincidence when those laws at the local level started emerging in the late 60s and early 70s. It was demonstrably in response to the Fair Housing Act of 1968, which explicitly made racial segregation in the public and private markets illegal. It is correlation. You can go back to the news articles in every part of Connecticut talking about the great downzoning that happened in Connecticut, but it was very much now we can't prevent a certain amount of person from living in our communities legally, so how do we find ways around that? And a really good, very difficult way that I'm sure Bill and Dwight will talk more about is through zoning policy. If you can't keep a certain lower income person out for legal reasons, you can do so for cost reasons. So you make it illegal to build smaller starter homes on smaller lots, as Kristen mentioned. You make it difficult to have density multifamily apartments, whether it's condos or apartments for lower income folks to live. You make everything car-centric, so you need to have a car to even get around your community. And what the result of that over 50 years is, I think the stats were already mentioned in the first panel, but over half of home renters in Connecticut are considered housing cost burden, about a third of home owners. The transportation cost in Connecticut because of sprawl is another 20 to 25% per household. So we are talking about a state where over 50% of a household's cost are out the door every month to the mortgage, to the landlord, or to the car insurance or the car payments. That is not a recipe for integration economically or racially. So the work Desegregate Connecticut is trying to do is tell this story first and foremost, but also to understand the barriers to that change from a political standpoint, economic standpoint, certainly a psychological standpoint. And we see it in it's so intracted, and even at a national scale, it's so intracted that there are efforts like Desegregate CT in other states having success changing zoning laws, and judges are overturning them. Not particularly in any case law, but they themselves have lived in a community that's single-family zoning, car-centric planning for 50 years, and it's inconceivable that that would somehow change, that their neighborhood might change. That's happened in Virginia, that's happened in Montana, that's happened in California, and a lot of other places. So it's not just a legal issue of changing zoning policy. It is a hearts and minds policy that we are really struggling with. And what I'll just add in terms of overcoming local opposition, it's really important to understand what it is and the nuances of it. Not everybody that opposes zoning changes is opposed to affordable housing, whether deed-restricted affordable housing or naturally affordable housing. There are people that have good faith concerns about the impact on traffic or on stormwater running off because of storm increases, or what it's going to look like for schools. Most of those things are actually not significant problems in Connecticut. They come up a lot in these local meetings, but generally you've got to meet people where they are. And you got to understand the different audiences we are trying to reach. The public that shows up against a project at a local P&Z meeting It's probably a little bit too late to get to them in some cases. But the commissioners that make these land use decisions that themselves are not necessarily legal experts or economic experts, how do you get to them, and how do you recognize that, hey, it's actually in our best interest in our community from a tax-based standpoint, from an environmental standpoint, to build these types of communities? So what Desegregate CT has done is really trying to focus on that commissioner level. We do trainings, we do events in communities, virtual community events. We try to get to the hearts and minds and recognize it's going to look a little bit differently, as Kristen mentioned, in every different community. But there are absolutely solutions that can push your community a little bit forward and to make housing a little bit more affordable and to think about what affordable actually means for communities. It's not always going to be the same thing in every community. There are going to be people with racial and economic classism biases, and you have to isolate those and recognize it's a bad faith argument, and you're not going to win those arguments. I want to close my section by talking about our public hearing that just happened on Monday. Desegregate CT's big state-level proposal called Work, Live, Ride is basically carrots on the local level and sticks on the state agency level to think about building transit-oriented communities and put state funding into those projects, into those communities. It's a pretty incremental bill. But we had a 13-hour hearing of people opposed to it, thinking the sky was falling, thinking it was state mandates, abolishing local control, some very subtle attacks on who's going to be coming into our communities. And I'm going to specifically call out one person. He's a public official. I don't feel bad about it. The first selectman of Greenwich, Fred Camillo, who in certain cases actually has been more open to some of these ideas than not. But he testified for probably about 2 hours on this public hearing. And he brought up a lot of the same arguments. We're doing a lot already in Greenwich. We have limited space. People that bought a home 50 years ago that it's appreciated aren't millionaires now. We have 4 train stations, but we can't build more around them. That really demonstrates a specific challenge that local elected officials have, hearing loudly from folks that oppose this stuff and basically not hearing from the people that don't live in these communities yet because the housing doesn't exist. So there's an incentive issue politically for folks that are elected where they're hearing from constituents in town that are against this for the most part. They're obviously not hearing from residents that could be here. They're not hearing from the young people that may be living with their parents or the workers, the workforce in town that can't come to these meetings. So ultimately, how do you engage with someone like that? There is a push and pull to it. The legal field has an immense role to hold folks accountable for the existing state laws, for affordable housing plans, for 8-2 zoning. There are things the legal community can absolutely do. But in a broader sense, the most effective thing that you can all do is honestly show up. Show up in those community spaces, show up in those meetings, whether as a lawyer, a homeowner, a home renter, a local business owner, and talk about the positive side of what this vision can look like. Because that's the best way to do it. I can helicopter in, folks can file lawsuits, but if it's neighbors saying we want this, that's what's going to make a difference in Connecticut. So I'm going to wrap up there and happy to take questions after.
So good morning, everyone. My name's Bill Hennessey. I come to this meeting from a decidedly non-academic point of view. I'm a zoning lawyer, practice in Southwest Connecticut. Our office is in Stamford. I'll be good in a second. So, I'm at the hearings at night. I'm listening to the neighbors. I'm trying to effectuate what you're trying to do, Peter, as an advocate for change. We're trying to get people building permits and developers with excavators on the ground building buildings. I want to say, Peter, we admire the work you do, the policy work. As somebody who's been in the field for more than 30 years doing this, it's noble work. A fair warning, though, there's 2 of us just on this podium that have done it for that long. And when we began, we had full head of hair. So, and so if you want to see your future self, look to your left and look to your right. So the topic here is, real estate law as a catalyst for closing the racial wealth gap. From a personal point of view, I think the best way to do that, the most effective thing that we can do as real estate lawyers is close the housing problem, the lack of housing. We have it here badly. I spend a lot of time in Los Angeles. Our problems don't compare to the national scale of communities like that, but there's serious problems here. And I agree with you 100%. They're going to get worse, and they're going to get worse quickly. So let's address it now, is how we feel about it. I've been practicing in the land use world for, as I said, over 3 decades. The last 10 years, the overwhelming majority of our work is involving housing, and almost all of it dense multifamily housing. You said something when you brought up the amount of land that we have that is single-family zoned. It didn't surprise me at all. But what might surprise you is I can't think of a project in the last 10 years that my team worked on. We have 8 zoning lawyers that are very busy. We haven't worked on a single typical suburban subdivision where somebody's plowing up a fresh field and building, single-family houses. Now, maybe that's because of where we live. It might be, southwestern Connecticut's a little dense, it's a little more urban, but there's nobody out there, and I don't think there's the demand out there in the community for that kind of housing. So the good news, I think, is the market is pushing hard toward multifamily dense housing in urban areas, and that may be a pathway to solution. We can talk about the challenges of that in a little bit. My little slice of this program involves talking about case studies. So I'd like to talk to you about 2 towns in Connecticut, and they're very different. One is a large city, large by Connecticut standards. We don't have real cities. I mean, this city's like 135, 136,000 people. It's got about 58,000 housing units. The other is much smaller. It is the movie set version of a leafy, wealthy suburban town, and it has been in movies. About 22,000 people, about 7,300 housing units. One came to embrace, and they're both success stories. So I'm the upbeat guy. They're both success stories. One came to embrace multifamily and affordable housing by being dragged, kicking and screaming through every court you can imagine, just getting punched and pummeled and bruised through 830Gs, some of which they succeeded in dragging out so long the market had changed and financing had changed, construction costs had changed. Delay, and sometimes you get what you want, which is nothing in their case. So they were successful. They spent a ton of money, and they got tired of it. And then they got some leadership in the form of a former first selectman who went on to be commissioner of housing here under Governor Malloy, to just change the paradigm. Instead of fight, let's try to fix the problem. Let's understand what it is. So they've had a run now, I would say, of almost 20 years where they've had success, and we'll talk about them. The other town, the larger city, came to it by just having smart leadership a long time ago, like in the 1990s. They were doing their POCD, which they're required to do every 10 years, and they said, people complain. Everybody's coming to these meetings and complaining about the price of housing. Maybe we should start putting that in our POCD. Maybe we should try to achieve some goals. Just set out some standards. And they came up with a goal, the people that were doing the planning commission, of creating 10,000 units of affordable housing. A nutty, unattainable, dumb number, but a goal and a meaningful goal. And it caught the eye of the separate zoning board, who said, well, hell, we're never going to build 10,000 units of affordable housing, but we should do something that is meaningful. And, the economy's pretty good. And so let's try it. So in the early 2000s, they recrafted what had been a kind of a corny, almost voluntary, inclusionary zoning regulation, and they crafted it into a meaningful one that really stunned the development community, But they fought it, and then they followed it, right? They required in any project with 10 or more units that 10% of the units be affordable to people making not more than 50% of that town's standard metropolitan median income. And all that's happened since then is the percentage has gone up. Okay, so let's take a look at each of these towns. Now they're different towns, but the irony is they're next to each other. They couldn't be more different. They border each other. One has a contract to accept the other's sewage that was negotiated in, I don't know, the 1940s or something. So let's talk about them. The first one is Darien. How do we? Now would be a good time to help me out. Hey, how you doing? I teach land use here Thursday nights, and this smart fellow rescues me in my class.
Sewers?
Yeah, that's good.
All right. Well, that's a slide. All right.
How do I get to the next one?
Sorry. This one.
Yep, that's what we want. Yeah, perfect. So here we go, Darien. It's got just under 22,000 residents. As I said, 7,300 housing units. Now, Darien took a snapshot of itself going from 2000. It has produced, since that time, just a little over 1,100 housing units, which is seismic for Darien. Because remember, all this has to happen in a very condensed area of Darien. The sewage capacity of the town is very, very limited. As I mentioned, it's got a contract with Stanford. It doesn't have a sewage treatment plant. Its affordability scale is 80% of the state median income, which you know is 91%. The average median household income in Darien is just under $300,000. So this is kind of psychologically, having, affordable housing in this town is a big deal, and they came to it not easy. The average sale price of a single family house is, $2.25 million. So how did they achieve this? And I think the way they did it, it's because they understood that they had certain advantages that other towns didn't have. They have a Main Street village corridor that's very horizontal, very linear. It's not a typical village, but it's dense. It's got 2 train stations, Metro North stations. They're great commuting stations. I mean, they are, 10 minutes into Stamford and, call it an hour into Midtown Manhattan. They have and had an aging office park development, 2 or 3 of them, that they were smart enough to see in pre-COVID days as aging out, maybe not that powerfully tenanted. They saw in the crystal ball that they were going to have problems with these, and that's not good to have them empty. It kind of erodes the tax base. They knew they had to do something, or Peter was going to come after them and try to put more affordable housing somewhere, so they decided to get out ahead of it. They commissioned studies. They encouraged developers to help rebuild some of their publicly or semi-publicly owned housing stock that was getting old. They pushed hard. They pushed hard for it. They also had a couple of retail strips that they saw were looking a little old and maybe not serving the community in the way they used to. And both of them were directly across from the Norotan train station. So they went to work. They rezoned themselves. And they created their own affordable housing inclusionary zoning reg. And they did the first one in 2009, and they tinkered with it, and they still tinker with it. They did it in 2009, they tinkered with it in 2010, 2011, 2012, 2016, 2017, and 2021. And at each stop along those tinkerings, they made it more inclusive and wider and made it more difficult, if you will, on the developer. So now it stands at 14% of all new housing has to be affordable to those making not more than 80% of the state median income. They also adopted along the way about a year ago an ADU regulation. And probably more important and more impressively from their point of view, they began to study their sewage system, which had been falling into terrible state of repair, even though all they had was pipes and pumps. Nobody cared about it. And they recognized through some of this recent flooding and these big rainstorms that this thing was getting just overwhelmed by groundwater. And they've begun to, they study the system, they know where the problems are, they're replacing pipe, they're increasing capacity by doing nothing more than keeping groundwater out of their sewage system. So it's been a good story, I think. You know, I will tell you, it's kind of nice to go there now. Let's go to Stamford next. I think I should, Stamford, okay, right next door, shares the border. Population 136,000, about 58,000 housing units. So the difference here, these slides, it's not apples to apples. This is Stamford from 2015, okay? This is only really a 10-year slice. Darien gave you a 24-year slice. Stamford has produced about 9,000 new housing units in the last 15 years. Just under 1,000 of them are affordable. Stanford's affordability scale is a little different. It's differently measured, but it hits the same kind of income people when you do the math. Stanford's median household income is about 106,000. It's the measuring stick for the Stanford metropolitan statistical area is about 181,000, and that's the number used. The median sale price of a housing unit, as distinct in Darien, the number I gave you, was for a single-family house. In Stanford, the median price of a housing unit, condo or single-family house, is $676. So the numbers aren't quite right. There's another 2,500 units in Stanford already approved, going through either financing or pre-construction, those sorts of things. Those units will come online between the next 24 and 34 months. So Stanford is moving. So what is it that Stanford and Darien have in common that maybe other towns don't? Before we get there, let me just tell you, Stanford is always examining its policies, and last year adopted a new affordable housing study that told it what it knew, and this is kind of remarkable. It told it that it had served the Stanford community and had solved the problem of workforce housing for either singles, couples without children, or small families. In other words, those people that could live in a studio, a one-bedroom, or a two-bedroom. But it had missed the, and continues to miss in a big way, so-called family housing. You know, a couple or a parent with two children of the opposite sex, when you need 3 bedrooms, and you likely need deeper affordability, because maybe one of the parents works in healthcare or childcare, and the other might be stocking groceries at a supermarket. Those people are going to have incomes below what they're able to afford for the unit, particularly a bigger unit. Now, these developers have to build and provide the housing on the same paradigm that their market rate is. So nobody was building the 3 families. So now Stanford has changed its rules so that developers are now encouraged to buy out, pay a fee, the so-called fee in lieu, into an affordable housing trust fund. So just the mathematics work as follows. The average high-rise you see in Stanford probably has 250, 300 units. Those units, when you do the math, a fee in lieu for those would be about $9 to $11 million in fee in lieu payments, which would go into the Affordable Housing Trust Fund. So within a year or so, and the city fathers and mothers are out there encouraging developers, even ones with approved projects, to come back and take the fee in lieu. Let's amass $50, $60 million and see what we can do about building larger units in areas we want to build. So that's their tool. So what do these towns have in common? Number one, they have good leadership on this issue through and through. Republicans, Democrats, both towns have been committed over time to to solving the affordable housing. The other thing, frankly, that they have is they have been strong, they've been very attractive to market rate housing. Developers want to be there, developers want to build in those towns, and developers will sort of pay the price of affordable housing. Not every town has that good fortune. And they've also benefited from a pretty good economy over the past decade or so. I see my time is up. I'm sure you have questions. I'm here to answer them. But on this happy note, let me just tell you, I cut my teeth as a lawyer when I was a young associate, carrying briefcases for really, really smart real estate lawyers. And we spent most of our time litigating against the town of Darien. And it just went on and on and on, and it was crazy stuff. And maybe it's a sign of my age, but 72 hours ago, I was in Darien Town Hall when the P&Z Commission unanimously approved its largest multifamily development ever with 14% affordability. And they did so, it felt more like they were partners in the project than they were opponents or judges. It was a good night and a good feeling, and they deserve credit for it, I would say. Thank you.
Timer here. It's running, 17 seconds into it, all right. While you're here, why don't you could you read these notes and just sit down and watch back there? All right, back up one. There you go. Hi, I'm Dwight Merriam. I'm a planner and a lawyer. My license plate number is zoning. I've been in this field for 53 years, since 1972, when I returned from Vietnam and started planning school. Why does it sound like an AA meeting introduction? I don't know. I didn't realize how old I was until the other day when I was getting, Pete and I live in Simsbury, single-family detached house, and I didn't realize how old I was until the other day when I went to get the roof replaced on my house. Anybody had a roof replaced? Really expensive, right? That's, another affordable housing issue. But when I got the contract, it was so much. I said to the guy, I said, this is crazy. And he said, well, Mr. Merriam, this is a 40-year roof. And I found myself saying, how much for a 13-year roof? That's when you know you're old. So the only advantage of being old is I get a discount at some Dunkin' Donuts, which I've used plenty of times, as you can see, and you get head-of-the-line privileges at Amtrak. But the other thing is you get to look back and see what's happened. And today, having worked my whole life with land use planning and law, and a lot of it affordable housing, my first book in 1984, the title was picked by the American Planning Association. Hiram will remember it. The inclusionary zoning moves downtown. In all that time, we have made not only little progress, but we've slipped backwards. This conference is about the black-white wealth gap, right? I don't think I've heard yet what the numbers are today. We had a great first panel, and this is an excellent panel, and I'm so happy to be here. Do you know what that gap is? The Brookings Institution says 171,000 for whites, 17,000 for black, 10%. Another estimate's 15%. That gap has not closed since right after the Civil War, when black Americans finally had access to some of the sources of wealth, principally in business and commerce. But in housing, that gap has not closed. Since I really got into this, looking back to 1960, if you look at a graph of that, and I've got an article that has these graphs, I'll put them up on LinkedIn, all right? That's the best way to find them. I get back to my office today, I'm going to put up an article I'm going to speak about, and another article that's in progress that has some of these numbers in it. But I am sad, I'm angry, I'm distressed, I'm frustrated at the end of my career to see that we've got nowhere. And I'm also bothered by my own misunderstanding. I just read Adam Grant's book, Think Again. Anybody seen this book? All right, one person. Great book, isn't it? Great book. I hardly ever recommend books, but I recommend this one. Adam Grant says we have to constantly test our own beliefs, our own value systems, things that we think are right and they're not. One of the things I worked my whole career on was affordable housing in rental, housing assistance payments contract, portable contracts. That was a terrible mistake, because the way we're going to close the black-white wealth gap is with home ownership. That's where white people have made all their money. Black people had 18 million acres of land right after the Civil War. How many million acres do they have today? 2. And they were taken because of heirs property, H-E-I-R-S. Their land was stolen from them. That was their basis of wealth, and it's gone. And so our challenge is in part of how to close that gap. And you've heard plenty of good ideas here already today and on this panel. I'm going to talk about a couple of things: legally enforceable covenants and NOAA, 2 things that I've just got into the last few years. All the work that Pete Harrison, Desegregate Connecticut, Sarah Bronin, the Zoning Atlas have done is terribly important. And 830G overrides is critical. And all the initiatives that we're doing with zoning must be done, and must be expanded, must be strengthened. But they are for naught, because we have underlying that zoning a complex system of legally enforceable covenants, not racial covenants, but economic covenants that exclude. And economic exclusion is racial exclusion with that wealth gap. Does anybody disagree with me on that? That's our problem. And so I started to look at legally enforceable covenants that preclude affordable housing in an article entitled Roadblocks to Affordable Housing, published in the Urban Lawyer of the American Bar Association. That's one of the articles I'll put up on LinkedIn. You can go find it there. Look at these numbers. These are quick numbers from a few years ago, but basically you'll see the large majority of homeowners now live in places with covenants. And what are those covenants? Pete, you know my neighborhood. I bought there 25 years ago, so I had young children then. So I still own a home in Hartford, but I bought a home there because I thought it was a great place for them to be. I had no choice when I bought that lot. It already had a declaration of covenants and restrictions on it. And what do you think that declaration said? It was what we in the law call a contract of adhesion. I couldn't negotiate it. The developer had decided long before he started marketing lots in that neighborhood that maybe people would like exclusionary covenants. So it says single family, 3,000 square feet of minimum floor area, no wood, no vinyl siding, pavement, so forth, so forth. Everything to make a house expensive. Single family, no ADUs, no multiple family. And those covenants are in perpetuity. That's ridiculous. We are going to try to tie the hands of generations not yet born by private deals that the courts enforce? That's not right. So that's what we're talking about here, legally enforceable covenants. And here, look at these numbers, 70%. Hiram, you're a local land use planner, you see this all the time. Developers come in, your town's not looking at them hard. I know it, nobody is. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. But they come in with these declaration of covenants and restrictions that tie the hands of everybody. So we can rezone until we're blue in the face. And we need to do that. But we also need to look underneath that and figure out how to fix this situation and how to stop it from being perpetuated going forward. Our mapping programs, starting with Desegregate Connecticut and Sarah Bronin's initiative, and now the National Zoning Atlas, has had tremendous impacts on the public's perception of where these limitations are. But there is virtually nothing in this country. The University of Minnesota only has been mapping racial covenants and a little bit of the affordable covenants. I don't know, Pete, if you followed that at all at Minnesota, but that's it. We don't have maps of these covenants. We don't know where they are, and they're terribly difficult to surface. I worked with the Uniform Law Commission as the liaison from the ABA on the removal of racial covenants, which we now have a model law. And we need to preserve the history. It's a complicated business. Go to the Uniform Law Commission site, look it up, read it, understand it. But we haven't done anything about these legally enforceable covenants. So, what to do? It shouldn't be in perpetuity. These covenants never were. When I bought a house in New Haven, in the Westville section, when I went to law school there, the house was built in 1910. It had a single-family covenant on it. That whole neighborhood is principally multi-family now, apartments and these big old houses, because that covenant was for 20 years, not perpetuity. The developer wanted to sell a single-family neighborhood, keep the prices up, fine, but not forever. So we want to get our homeowners associations to amend these voluntarily. We want to reach out to them and help them realize how to do that. Eminent domain, oh, nobody wants to talk about that. But you could, a government, really a progressive government, could use limited powers of eminent domain to condemn out those restrictions so that people could go back in and intensify those developments. And you know what the damages would be in that case? Probably nothing. Why? Because if you remove the restrictions, the property's going to be more valuable. Reverse auctions. Anybody know what that is? It's, you know what a regular auction is? Whoever bids the most gets the item. Reverse auction, nobody's done it in this area, but I've been writing about it, suggesting we consider it. You go to the homeowners associations in your town and say, we're going to pay you money or reduce your taxes or do something economically if you will eliminate those restrictions. And whichever homeowners association bids the lowest to do that will get our money. Legislation not to enforce. California did this 2 years ago. You can't negate these legally enforceable restrictions. Okay, they're not racial discriminations. They are quite nearly directly, but so far the courts have not found that you can just say they're not enforceable. But California has adopted some legislation that says the government's enforcement limitations are, the courts do not need to enforce these. Court challenges itself on public policy. There's one case called Viking from 15 years ago. We're not getting anywhere on that. Finally, for all you local planners and others involved in local land use decision making, you should not be approving any project that has a declaration of covenants and restrictions without at least having a public discussion of how those may tie the hands of current people and future generations. And in fact, I would say that maybe the zoning power extends to prohibiting homeowners association documents that have those restrictions in them. Now let me turn to something else in the 3 minutes I have left. Thank you very much. You can just rest. You go back and get a cup of coffee, some fruit, maybe a bagel. All right? I got a timer here. All right? So, I was given a talk at a law school in New York, remain nameless, the beginning of December, 150 people, half planners, half lawyers in the room. I said, how many of you heard of NOAA? Because I hadn't heard about it until like 3 years ago. I said, I'm an idiot. I wanted to hear about this. So I'm not going to embarrass you by asking you how many have heard of NOAA. Just tell you that I'm sorry I had not, because once I got into it, I realized this is a big, big deal. And we're all, most of us are asleep at the switch. This is an AI-generated graphic. I love doing graphics with AI. This is what our affordable housing work looks like. We got a big bucket of affordable housing, right? Right? We're dumping as much new construction in the top as we can, and it's not enough by a long shot. Recent study says we need 110,000 units in the next 10 years. Massachusetts was twice that in a recent study. We're not getting close to that. But what's happening at the same time? Look at the bottom of this bucket. The naturally occurring affordable housing, NOAA, is leaking out the bottom. How much NOAA do we have? What is it? It's residential rental, unsubsidized, affordable. There are low prices in the market. You know, around the country, they might average $550 to $1,200, a little higher here. Low and moderate income households. And fully 75% of our affordable housing in this country, nationwide, is NOAA. Unsubsidized, naturally occurring, affordable housing. And we have no program in Connecticut at the state level to preserve affordable housing. I called every agency I could. Oh, we don't know. We don't do that. Very few states do. And, but some organizations do promote it. So what can we do? We need interventions at 3 levels. We need to help the landlords of this housing, and we heard a little bit of that on the first panel, with taxes, help them do ADUs to get more cash flow, look at code improvements. We heard some of that in the first panel too, about code enforcement. We need to talk about helping them with energy cost, financing, and even buyouts. I had a conversation before the meeting about buying out people when they can't do it. And renters and owner occupants need rent subsidies, assistance for owner occupants, and states need to strengthen their housing trust funds, have targeted NOAA preservation programs, and local governments need to plan for it. You need to identify where those units are. And you know, Hiram, most towns don't do that. They're not identifying where they are. And the 830G folks are wrestling about, can you count them or not? Stop that argument. Just go find them and keep them and help them. That's the best thing that we can do to avoid this problem. Knocking ourselves out to build new housing, standing by when 70% of our housing stock, 70% of our affordable housing stock, all unsubsidized, is at risk and disappearing. Thank you for your attention.
Wow. Great panel. At this point, we're going to open it up to Q&A. We have one in the back.
And I wanted to know, why is it better in some towns and some cities in Connecticut to build housing, and why is it not so good in other towns? And what can we do as community people to make it better in Connecticut?
Yeah, great. Great first question. And, you know, Bill talked about this a little bit too. It really can shift pretty quickly when there is leadership in a town to embrace this. And the nice thing about this pro-homes movement that we're a part of is it's not partisan. There are states and actors across the country that are center-right, center-left, and it doesn't take a particular party to embrace this. And honestly, in some cases, particularly in Connecticut, both parties can resist to it. But there are arguments, whether it's economic arguments, environmental arguments, equity arguments, that work across the political spectrum. So if you're fortunate enough in a community where you've got a great first selectman that's really worried about the tax increases coming down the pike, or has developments that are aging out that recognizing markets are changing, or hey, we're actually losing child age residents significantly, which is most of the state. We've got all these school buildings and we're not gonna have kids in there. If you have folks that have a little bit of vision and recognize what's out there happening right now, they have an ear in their community, then you're going to have those solutions. And it's going to look differently, as Kristen said, and as others have said. Darienne's not going to start building sky rises like Stamford is. Honestly, maybe in 20 or 30 years, but not right now, so there are different solutions to it. So it's a certain amount of courage at this point of the cycle for people. But once you take that leap and have that leadership and have, maybe it's some people on the commission, maybe it's an affordable housing committee, maybe it's Chamber of Commerce, whatever it might look like, to come together and say, okay, well, we kind of recognize the problem. What are those solutions? And then that's where it gets a little bit easier, because there are a ton of solutions. There are a significant amount of challenges, and there's a significant amount of things that are totally out of the control of a local government, or frankly even a state government, in terms of costs and other things has been outlined. But you can control land use, you can control where you put town resources, and you can control what you want your town to be, who you want it to be for. And generally speaking, most people, and you poll, want the towns to be affordable, inclusive, and sustainable, want the kids to be able to stay, want the parents to downsize and stay in town. So it's just honestly listening to your community. And it's not just the people showing up screaming in your ear. I'm also going to blast out Fred Camillo from Greenwich again, because he got called out on the public hearing. Somebody asked him, what's the average rent of a 2-bedroom apartment in Greenwich? And I think he said something like $1,200, and there's a big laugh about it. It's like $5,000, actually. So that, again, you need leadership that recognizes actually what the situation on the ground is, first of all, and then recognizes it's a problem, and recognizes there are many solutions that you can have some impact on, with recognizing the limitations of that.
And also, I wanted to know, is talking to your local government will impact how different towns and cities in the state to build housing and affordable housing?
Yeah, I mean, I joke with my interns all the time. Half the battle in this work is showing up. The other half is showing up on time. It really is just show up. If there's 1 or 2 people at a meeting that say, hey, actually, I really like this idea. I really like accessory dwelling units as of right. Or, it'd be really awesome if we had a big apartment building by the train station so my kids can move back here. That matters a great deal. And just showing up and having those conversations, someone else is going to come up after you and say, well, I really appreciate you saying that. I didn't have the courage to say it because I felt like I was the only person. And then the ball gets rolling. We've been asked to speak at every planning and zoning commission in the state. We've spoken at probably over 70 of them. And every single commission, and I believe this in good faith in my heart, there's some part of a community, it's big town, big city, small town, that knows a part of the town where they want to see this kind of development and just needs a little bit of a push and support from the community. So those pieces are in place. It's not as organized as it should be, but that's definitely the immediate start anyone can do, is just show up and say, hey, this is a good idea. I want this for my community, and the ball's going to get rolling from there. It's not the only thing that has to happen, but it's the first and most important piece of it.
So my question is for Pete also. I've done a fair amount of legislative advocacy in my field, which is elder law, and so I'm accustomed to the hearings and things that you've described, your Monday hearing. Your organization, what do you do as far as trying to create more presence for what you're looking for at the legislature as far as advocacy goes? Because it comes up quickly, as we know. And there will be people that know and want to be there, but what do you do as sort of a outreach to try to draw in more advocates for what you're advocating for?
Yeah, sorry, I'm getting the first questions here. In the specific circumstances for our public hearing, usually what happens is you get a bill number at the state legislature, and then you just wait weeks before your public hearing. It was very unprecedented for us. We got the bill number and the hearing number with less than a week to go, which is intentional. We've been doing this bill this is the 3rd session now. A lot of buy-in from the leadership in both chambers and the governors, and just, we should have passed last year, the short session. Things are a little bit harder in the Senate. So we hoped to get super, super early. That was the first possible day of hearings, which we did. We weren't sure it was going to happen, so when it did happen, we were caught a little bit off guard. But typically, it's about having this community of advocates and people curious about this stuff in place. And we've got a newsletter that goes out every week on Wednesdays. If you haven't signed up for it, it's desegregatect.org. It has all kind of local meetings, news articles about what's happening nationally or locally, oftentimes articles, law articles or otherwise, to give people not just information, but also a sense of community. I keep coming back to that. It's just, you're not alone. You might be the only commissioner in your town or the only person showing up at the commission meetings, but there are lots and lots of people in the state that care about it. So that's what we're trying to build up from an advocacy standpoint, is just recognizing that you're speaking for a larger vanguard movement that cares a great deal about these issues and is just kind of learning how to activate themselves for it. So I will admit, I don't think we did a great job. Because it was so fast this particular week, we're not super worried about the public hearing process right now anyway. But yeah, it's just building up that community, whether it's folks in the legal field, builders, environmental groups, folks that are not associated with community groups or anything like that, just interested citizens, trying to have space to hang out and meet each other and talk about ideas and nerd out about stuff and be excited about what Connecticut could look like or what my town could look like if these things change. So it's a slow process. There is no, I think everybody here in this entire conference is going to say there's no silver bullet, lawsuit that's going to come through, legislative change that's going to come through, construction, innovation. But it's building up all those ideas, getting all those really smart people in rooms like this, and keeping in touch with each other, even just socially, just to build up that community is the way to get this stuff done in the medium term.
So I'm throwing the question out. I guess anyone on the panel could answer it. So my question with regard to affordable housing and the real definition of affordable housing. In 2000, in the early 2000s, affordable housing, a couple earning minimum wage could afford a house, the average house, and I'm going to use Bloomfield, for $150,000. Not only, and then we had the market wherein when buyers went out to make an offer and you were over offering, you'd offer $1,000 over asking. That was considered wild. In 2019 BC, before Corona, we had the housing prices had pretty much doubled. You couldn't exactly afford it with minimum wage, but could with a little bit of extra help. In 2024 today, that's not even a possibility. And what we are seeing is, how do we balance the desires of developers who have gone more to a subscription model, well, not just in terms of housing, subscription is now rent, where we're building a lot of rental units, where the rental cost of rents now for a 3-bedroom is in excess of $3,000. Don't know how people afford it. But also between 2000 and 2024, not only have prices of houses gone up to make it unaffordable, taxes have doubled and tripled. So how are municipalities saying we're doing affordable housing when our taxes in 2024 was our full mortgage payment in 2000? Incomes haven't gone up. How do we bridge that income wealth gap when people can't afford the housing prices and the desires of developers who see a better model in creating luxury rental units and creating affordable houses for people to buy and own and live? As you said, home ownership is the goal. How do we balance all of that to look to the future? Because I'm not sure how much we look to the future back in 2000 to 2024, because the problem didn't get better, it got worse.
Well, I'll make an observation. One of the things I frankly should have mentioned and didn't, a commonality between the Darien efforts and the Stanford efforts is that both failed miserably in their attempts to create owner-occupied affordable housing. They just couldn't figure it out. Mm-hmm. And at the end of the day, they were left with trying to manage the program. A rental program in a community is easier to manage for a municipality. You have the inventory of units, you know exactly where they are, you have an affordability plan filed on the land records, and you have a yearly reporting by the owner of the building. So you're able to watch it, track it, make sure things aren't happening that are nefarious, make sure that people aren't residents of an affordable unit and have then sublet it out at a market rate not-for-profit, or that they remain eligible for the affordable unit. That takes an enormous amount of government time and effort just to keep track of an inventory when you've got a couple of few thousand units in your town. But with the affordable programs, what they couldn't figure out how to do was sort of track it. You know, neither town had an enormous amount of it, but there were two problems. Number one, people tended to buy into their affordable units and stay there. They wouldn't move. They would stay, which is fine, which is good. It gives them, they had a mortgage. The mortgage was usually subsidized and underwritten. They usually had a second mortgage on top of that, which was a grant that would burn off in time. They got incredible financial benefit to be able to move into what were very nice condominiums. And they stayed. So there was an expectation on their part that they would share in the appreciation at the end when they left. But then the mathematics got real complicated. Like, what percentage of the appreciation should they be entitled to? Because if they were entitled to 100% of the appreciation, then that meant that when they were allowed to buy, they actually got a lottery ticket. I mean, we had lotteries. I mean, hundreds of people would sign up and pull a name out of a hat. And, oh, Dwight Merriam, you get the unit at River House. And is that fair? You know, there's only so much money. And to award, on a competitive basis, that kind of financial windfall seemed to the city to be unfair. So they limited the amount, the percentage of the appreciation that you should recapture. And that was very disappointing to many people. Now, many people, in case of many people, it's their estates that are disappointed that mom and dad, they lived here for 20 years, and now we thought the unit was worth $700,000. She only paid $106,000. It originally sold for $400,000. We thought we'd get it all, but you don't get it all. And dealing with that is difficult. I don't know that municipalities are real good at solving that level of inequity. Municipalities are best at creating the opportunity for the private sector to invest money to build for their profit, but making them build something else too for the community at large, and that's the form of affordable housing. And as you correctly note, these days it's taking mostly the form of rental housing, because that's where the development community would rather be when they're building in scale. It's much, much more definable and ascertainable. They know they can build a building. They know that they are renting units. They know there's a demand. They're not out selling that unit and that unit and that unit and that unit. They're not waiting for a return on their investment. They get the building up. They get it stabilized. It's a stabilized asset. They show a great net operating income, and an insurance company from Texas buys the building and invests in it, and they're done, and they've made their money. That's the paradigm of what's going on out there now. That's what you see. So I don't have an answer for you, but that's why you see what you see.
Do we have time for follow-on comment, if I could just? Briefly, sure. Shared equity. Shared equity. Shared equity. That's where we need to go. I don't like any of the controls under 830G. I could go on for a very long time about the problems. Bill just touched on them. Resales are terrible. You can be underwater in a rising interest rate market. It's bad. People get blown up. They lose all their equity. The late Paul Davidoff, when he was dying of brain cancer, I was sitting with him. He was a famous, Hiram, another older person in the room, remember Paul Davidoff, spent his life advocating on the Suburban Action Institute. Well, you know him by reputation, Pete. But he said to me at the end, he said, I wished I hadn't worked so hard to try to build affordable housing. I wished I had devoted myself to just building housing, because he sort of believed in trickle down. So I believe now, at this stage, that controlled resale prices and rentals are problematic, that we ought to build as much housing as we can, and that the government ought to subsidize through shared equity the acquisition of units for ownership. And what happens in the end, it solves your problem, Bill. The government writes down the value by giving the owner 20% or 30% of the value. When they sell it, they get 20 to 30% of the value back with interest and the homeowner gets. So that's why I say in housing trust funds in my recommendation that we got to find ways to build big housing trust funds and have the government invest in shared equity and get more owners that way. And besides opening up the market to making housing easier to build.
So, thank you. To keep our program on time, if anyone has questions for the panelists, I suggest that you maybe find them by the coffee or by the refreshments and ask them then. I want to thank our panelists for a really informative, lively conversation, and thank you all for your attention. We're going to take a 5-minute break so you can grab coffee and come back re-energized for panel 3, which is on community education and coalition building. So thanks again.